Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights. Let the noise of the day fade into the background. And if you enjoy these quiet reflections on forgotten lives, consider subscribing. No pressure, only if it feels right. Maybe leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see where in the world these stories find their home. Now breathe in, let it go, and follow me back, far across the centuries, to a world shaped by silence, devotion, and an ever-present awareness of death. In ancient Japan, not all warriors wielded swords. Some chose a life away from the battlefield, away from politics and power. They shaved their heads, donned simple robes, and walked into the rigid discipline of the monastery. They were monks, but not in the romanticized sense of calm sages floating above the world. Their days were not gentle. Their nights were not restful. They didn't live in escape. They lived in confrontation, especially with the inevitability of death. To become a monk was to begin preparing for your own end from the moment your head was shaved. Not in a dramatic, morbid way, but in a slow, methodical practice of letting go. Letting go of identity, of attachments, of ego, of life's pleasures, and eventually, life itself. The monastery was not a sanctuary from death. It was a training ground for it. Even the architecture reminded you. Walkways designed for barefoot steps forced attention with every move. Narrow sleeping quarters denied comfort. The gardens were manicured not for beauty, but for contemplation. Rocks and moss arranged to reflect impermanence, asymmetry, and simplicity. Every corner of the space was designed to remind you, this is temporary. All of it. But what made these monks different wasn't just their study or rituals. It was their posture toward mortality. While most of the world flinched from the thought of dying, they practiced it daily. They meditated on corpses, recited sutras for the dead, visualized their own decomposition, and examined the fear that crept in when the lights went out. They didn't deny it. They met it head on. This wasn't despair. It was clarity. Because in accepting death, fully and without illusion, they believed one could begin to live with truth. So tonight, we step into their world. A world of incense and silence, of ritual and renunciation, of life lived as if each moment might be the last, because one day it would be. The process of dying wasn't reserved for the last breath. For Japanese monks, it began in life. And more than that, it became life itself. Death wasn't some distant destination lurking at the end of the road. It was a companion that walked beside them, step for step. A teacher that whispered constant reminders. A mirror they returned to, again and again, until the image it reflected no longer sparked fear, but understanding. It became part of the daily rhythm. Intimate, inescapable, real. Each morning began not with the warmth of the sun or the softness of a bed, but with the cold echo of a bell. A single chime rang through the halls, stretched over stone floors and through wooden beams, breaking the silence with reverence. It didn't just summon the body to rise. It summoned the spirit to remember, to return to purpose. As the world outside still yawned and stretched awake, the monks were already moving through rituals. Simple, strict, deliberate. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. Every motion had weight, every breath had intention. Their heads remained bowed, not from shame, but from focus. Their voices, when used, stayed low. Their movements were quiet, bordering on invisible. Even walking had rules. Heels never struck the floor with force. Every footstep was mindful, soft, ghost-like. Silence wasn't merely enforced. It was cultivated. A spiritual practice, as important as prayer. They washed not for appearance, but to purify the senses. Cold water on the face, a rinse of the mouth, small acts to ready the body. Then came the chanting. Low, rhythmic tones filled the temple walls. They recited sutras, some for the living, many for the dead. Chanting wasn't performance. It was meditation through sound. Their breath followed the words. Their minds stayed anchored to each syllable, like hands gripping a rope in a storm. The repetition was soothing. Its slow thought. Its softened ego. Meals were another ritual, taken in silence, usually simple, a thin broth, plain rice, pickled vegetables, no meat, no spices, nothing to awaken cravings or ignite pleasure. Just fuel. The bowls were cleaned not with cloth, but with hot water, swirled and then sipped, leaving nothing behind. Waste was a kind of pride. So was luxury. There was gratitude, but not directed to a god in the sky. Gratitude was offered to impermanence, because even the food would pass, even the satisfaction of a full stomach would fade. And that was the point. Nothing stayed. Nothing lingered. Later came work, practical, earthy, grounding. Monks swept paths with brooms made of straw. They stacked wood for the hearth. They pulled weeds, trimmed trees, tended gardens. But these weren't chores. Every task was a continuation of practice. Every act was prayer. Hands moved with focus. Eyes stayed on the present. A single leaf falling could hold meaning. The wind rustling the bamboo could stop them mid-step. Behind every movement lingered the awareness. This moment is already gone. This breath is a gift that dissolves as soon as it's taken. Death was not only acknowledged, it was studied. They copied scrolls that described the decay of the human body in painstaking detail. Diagrams and paintings depicted rot, bone, and bloated flesh. Skulls and skeletons weren't hidden. They were reminders. Death was not morbid. It was honest. It wasn't something to be feared. It was something to prepare for, to understand, to accept. Their lives weren't hard for cruelty's sake. They were structured for clarity, for presence, for truth. Simplicity wasn't punishment. It was revelation. When you strip away comfort, when you remove distraction, what remains is sharpness, insight, a raw awareness that life is brief and beautiful in its fading. What mattered wasn't how long you lived, but how deeply you saw it as it happened. And so they moved through their days like wind through trees, soft, purposeful, aware, with quiet eyes and open hands, not clinging to anything, not running from anything, just breathing, just being. Each act was a rehearsal, each breath a preparation, until the time came when breathing would stop, and everything they practiced would finally unfold into truth. It's early morning. The light hasn't fully touched the treetops yet, and the temple grounds are still wrapped in a thick, silvery mist. A bell sounds in the distance. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to stir the sleeping world. This is the monk's first reminder. Time is always passing, and every breath brings him one step closer to death. Not metaphorically, literally. Every exhale is a small surrender. The idea of meditating on death might sound grim to us now, maybe even macabre or overly dramatic. But for monks in ancient Japan, particularly those devoted to Zen or Tendai Buddhism, it was not just a spiritual exercise, it was a daily obligation. Death wasn't the shadow at the end of the road. It was the quiet figure walking beside you, every hour of every day, not to be feared, not to be worshipped, but to be acknowledged, to be studied, to be made into something familiar so its arrival would not bring panic. When a monk opened his eyes in the morning, there were no soft sheets or warming rays, no idle moments of stretching under thick blankets. There was no comfort for the sake of comfort. The bed was a wooden plank or a thin straw mat, and the air was often cold. The body, stiff and sore, learned to rise immediately. Delay was a form of indulgence, and indulgence had no place in the temple. Silence reigned during the first movements of the day, not because speech was forbidden, but because words carried the risk of distraction. The morning began not with conversation, but with cleaning. This wasn't for appearances or hygiene. It was for discipline, mindfulness, control. A monk might sweep the stone walkways while dew still clung to the moss, scrubbing the wooden floors with water drawn from a freezing basin. He might rinse his face with the same water, shocking the body into alertness, into awareness. Every action mattered. Every movement held weight. And throughout those tasks, there would be internal chanting or mental recitations of verses grounded in impermanence. Sayings like, "All things are like a dream, a phantom, a bubble," weren't poetry. They were anchors, reminders. The body would age. The wood would rot. Smoke would rise and vanish into the wind. Everything would pass. Everything would die. The practice wasn't meant to make the monk morbid. It was meant to prepare him for truth, to strip him of illusion. Then came zazen, sitting meditation. It sounds serene, but it wasn't a spa moment. It was confrontation with the self, with silence, with death. The monk would fold his legs, straighten his back, lower his gaze, and focus on his breath. In, outside. That simple. That impossible. When thoughts arrived, as they always did, they were noted, then released. No chasing, no suppressing, just letting go, like watching clouds drift across the sky and refusing to name their shapes. This wasn't a break from life. It was life, pared down to its essence. No music, no goals, just awareness, just presence. The monk learned to sit with discomfort, both physical and mental, until neither had power over him, until he could face the idea of death not with dread, but with clarity. Because the goal wasn't to win against death, or even to ignore it. The goal was to befriend it, to rehearse it, so that when the real moment came, not in some distant future, but possibly today, tomorrow, or during that very hour, he could meet it as calmly as he greeted the sun, with stillness, with readiness, with peace. That was the path. That was the training. And it began anew every single morning, before the world had even stirred. In the hushed calm of the monastery, morning wasn't marked by an alarm or rooster's crow. It began with the near silent shuffle of cloth against stone as monks stirred in unison. The halls echoed faintly with the brushing of hemp robes, the soft rustle of straw sandals slipping onto feet hardened by years of walking stone corridors. Even as the sun had not yet cast its light across the moss-covered temple roofs, one thing was certain. Each man who rose from his woven mat knew that today, like every day, was a rehearsal for dying. Preparing for death didn't mean seeking it. It meant living with its presence always in mind, like a shadow following just behind you, whispering quietly, but persistently. Japanese monks, especially those in the most austere sects like Zen and Tendai, embraced this constant awareness as part of their daily discipline. It wasn't morbid. It was clarity. Death wasn't feared. It was studied. It was expected. And it was folded into the very structure of their day, interwoven through every breath and movement. Their robes were simple, humble, dyed in tones that blended with the earth, stitched by hand, worn until the fabric frayed at the edges. No jewelry, no ornaments, no distractions. These garments were reminders. The body is temporary, the ego unnecessary, the self fleeting. Before even touching food or chanting the first sutra, monks performed ablutions, ritual washings not just of the body but of thought. Cold water from a basin cupped in both hands, poured over face and limbs. Cleansing was a metaphor, washing away distraction, washing away desire, washing away illusion, washing away the self. Meditation, or zazen, was not a comfort. It wasn't about peace, not in the way many might think. It was a daily confrontation with impermanence. Sitting motionless, legs folded into lotus or half lotus, eyes half lidded but not closed, back straight, breath steady. This wasn't relaxation. It was a sharpening of awareness, a confrontation with how fragile everything is. Pain in the knees or spine wasn't avoided. It was acknowledged, endured, accepted. In that stillness, monks examined their own thoughts, watching them rise and fall like waves, and like waves they vanished. Everything vanishes, even thoughts, even selves. The scrolls and calligraphy they practiced writing weren't just art. They were exercises in mortality. One wrong stroke, one misaligned line, and the work was ruined. And yet, they began again. They dipped the brush into ink made from soot and glue, held it upright, and moved with precision. Because like life, perfection wasn't guaranteed. The lesson was not in the final image. It was in the doing, the failing, and the willingness to begin again. Each scroll bore the weight of breath and impermanence, of effort without expectation. Meals were eaten in silence, not just because of custom, but because each bite was seen as a ritual, acknowledging where the food came from, who grew it, who prepared it, and what life it once held. Life begets life, and to eat meant accepting that something else died. Even the smallest grain of rice was never taken for granted. The bowl was wiped clean with a pickled vegetable, then eaten too. Nothing wasted, nothing left behind. As in life, so in death. Leave nothing undone. Everything has a place, and everything ends. And when monks walked through gardens or along temple corridors, their steps were deliberate, measured, each footfall a quiet sermon. They moved slowly, not out of frailty, but mindfulness. With each footstep, they reminded themselves, I am still alive, but I will not always be. The crunch of gravel beneath their sandals, the creak of a bamboo gate opening. These were not just sounds. They were echoes of presence, because the greatest preparation for death wasn't to mourn its arrival. It was to live every moment fully aware that it will, one day, come. To meet that moment not with fear, but with readiness. Not with regret, but with recognition. A monk's entire life was spent crafting that recognition, day by day, breath by breath, step by quiet step. They woke before the sun, not with alarm, but with discipline, not stirred by birdsong or the warmth of morning light through paper windows, but by the internal rhythm honed through repetition. Monks in ancient Japan didn't rise to seize the day. They rose to confront its end. Each day was another rehearsal for death, quiet, methodical, and unflinching. Because the goal wasn't to win against death, or even to ignore it. The goal was to befriend it, to rehearse it, so that when the real moment came, not in some distant future, but possibly today, tomorrow, or during that very hour, he could meet it as calmly as he greeted the sun, with stillness, with readiness, with peace. That was the path. That was the training. And it began anew every single morning, before the world had even stirred. In the hushed calm of the monastery, morning wasn't marked by an alarm or rooster's crow. It began with the near-silent shuffle of cloth against stone as monks stirred in unison. The halls echoed faintly with the brushing of hemp robes, the soft rustle of straw sandals slipping onto feet hardened by years of walking stone corridors. Even as the sun had not yet cast its light across the moss-covered temple roofs, one thing was certain. Each man who rose from his woven mat knew that today, like every day, was a rehearsal for dying. Preparing for death didn't mean seeking it. It meant living with its presence always in mind, like a shadow following just behind you, whispering quietly, but persistently. Japanese monks, especially those in the most austere sects like Zen and Tendai, embraced this constant awareness as part of their daily discipline. It wasn't morbid. It was clarity. Death wasn't feared. It was studied. It was expected. And it was folded into the very structure of their day, interwoven through every breath and movement. Their robes were simple, humble, dyed in tones that blended with the earth, stitched by hand, worn until the fabric frayed at the edges. No jewelry, no ornaments, no distractions. These garments were reminders. The body is temporary, the ego unnecessary. the self fleeting. Before even touching food or chanting the first sutra, monks performed ablutions, ritual washings not just of the body but of thought. Cold water from a basin cupped in both hands, poured over face and limbs. Cleansing was a metaphor, washing away distraction, washing away desire, washing away illusion, washing away the self. Meditation, or zazen, was not a comfort. It wasn't about peace, not in the way many might think. It was a daily confrontation with impermanence. Sitting motionless, legs folded into lotus or half lotus, eyes half lidded but not closed, back straight, breath steady. This wasn't relaxation. It was a sharpening of awareness, a confrontation with how fragile everything is. Pain in the knees or spine wasn't avoided. It was acknowledged, endured, accepted. In that stillness, monks examined their own thoughts, watching them rise and fall like waves, and like waves they vanished. Everything vanishes, even thoughts, even selves. The scrolls and calligraphy they practiced writing weren't just art. They were exercises in mortality. One wrong stroke, one misaligned line, and the work was ruined. And yet, they began again. They dipped the brush into ink made from soot and glue, held it upright, and moved with precision. Because like life, perfection wasn't guaranteed. The lesson was not in the final image. It was in the doing, the failing, and the willingness to begin again. Each scroll bore the weight of breath and impermanence, of effort without expectation. Meals were eaten in silence, not just because of custom, but because each bite was seen as a ritual, acknowledging where the food came from, who grew it, who prepared it, and what life it once held. Life begets life, and to eat meant accepting that something else died. Even the smallest grain of rice was never taken for granted. The bowl was wiped clean with a pickled vegetable, then eaten too. Nothing wasted, nothing left behind. As in life, so in death. Leave nothing undone. Everything has a place, and everything ends. And when monks walked through gardens or along temple corridors, their steps were deliberate, measured, each footfall a quiet sermon. They moved slowly, not out of frailty, but mindfulness. With each footstep, they reminded themselves, I am still alive, but I will not always be. The crunch of gravel beneath their sandals, the creak of a bamboo gate opening. These were not just sounds. They were echoes of presence, because the greatest preparation for death wasn't to mourn its arrival. It was to live every moment fully aware that it will, one day, come. To meet that moment not with fear, but with readiness. Not with regret, but with recognition. A monk's entire life was spent crafting that recognition, day by day, breath by breath, step by quiet step. They woke before the sun, not with alarm, but with discipline, not stirred by birdsong or the warmth of morning light through paper windows, but by the internal rhythm honed through repetition. Monks in ancient Japan didn't rise to seize the day. They rose to confront its end. Each day was another rehearsal for death, quiet, methodical, and unflinching. First came silence, the kind that wasn't empty, but deliberate. No greetings, no idle chatter. Only the sound of bare feet brushing against wooden floors as they moved to begin their morning routines, cleansing the face and mouth, folding bedding with precision. These small rituals weren't just about tidiness. They were reminders. Everything had its place, and eventually, so would you. The first meal, taken before sunrise, was as sparse and intentional as everything else. A thin porridge, maybe a few pickled vegetables. It wasn't designed to please. It was meant to sustain, to anchor the body without encouraging indulgence. Gratitude was offered, not for the flavor, but for the nourishment, and for the simple fact that one more meal had come, that you were still here to eat it. Chores followed, sweeping temple grounds, hauling water from wells, splitting wood, tending to gardens, Everything done with full attention, full presence, not because someone was watching, but because every act was a meditation, every breath a step closer to the end. You didn't just clean the floor. You erased distraction. You cleared away ego. Study came next. Sutras, scripture, and the writings of past masters. These weren't academic exercises. They were tools, sharpened slowly, used to chip away at fear and illusion. Every line was read not as text, but as truth. Monks memorized them, recited them, internalized them, not to sound wise, but to remember what really mattered, to detach from the body, from desire, from identity, because clinging was the root of suffering, and suffering was what bound you to this world. Death wasn't a threat. It was a teacher. As the sun climbed higher, they sat in meditation, legs crossed, backs straight, eyes lowered, breathing slowed. The goal wasn't peace, it was presence. Thoughts came. You let them pass. Pain came. You observed it. The mind wandered. You brought it back, again and again, until the mind no longer resisted the idea of stillness, until it no longer resisted the idea of disappearing altogether. There were no clocks, no schedules marked with ink, only bells, a soft chime to signal transitions, and with each bell, another breath passed, another moment slipped away. Time, like the body, was not something to hoard. It was something to notice and then to let go. All of this was practice, not for enlightenment, but for dying well. To be a monk in ancient Japan wasn't about escaping the world. It was about preparing to leave it. Every action was a soft rehearsal. Every silence, a goodbye, whispered in advance. And every morning the same thought returned. Today could be the last. So live like it, and die without fear. It was still dark when the monks began their day. There were no alarms, no bells, rung by choice. Only the steady rhythm of a life lived by discipline and ritual. The temple corridors were cold and silent, stone floors pressing their chill through the thin soles of woven sandals. Outside, the wind stirred through bamboo, whispering in a voice older than the temple itself. Inside, not a word was spoken. Silence wasn't just a practice. It was protection, a way to steady the mind and ready the body. In the darkness, a monk didn't need sight to know the steps. He had walked them countless times. The body moved before the mind caught up. Each monk stirred from his mat slowly, not because he lacked urgency, but because every movement was intentional. Their bodies had been shaped by habit, habits of restraint, of patience, of quiet pain. There were no luxuries, no soft blankets or heated rooms, just simple mats, thin bedding, and bodies trained to withstand discomfort. The chill of early morning was a reminder you were alive, but not forever. Your breath was visible in the air, and that meant you had work to do, the kind of work that started before the sun and ended only when the body demanded rest. And even then, rest was not guaranteed. Their robes were coarse, folded with care, then layered with the precision of someone who knew the order by heart. One wrap, one tie, one breath. Each piece of fabric placed with deliberation. The act of dressing was not rushed. Monks dressed not to express, but to erase. Uniformity was clarity. It stripped away ego and softened the grip of identity. The less they saw of themselves, the more clearly they saw the world. Colorless, quiet, indifferent. Before food, before speech, before even the light of the rising sun reached the temple's inner halls, the first task was washing. Cold water, often drawn by hand, splashed over faces and limbs. There was no indulgence in this. It wasn't to wake up or refresh. It was to cleanse body and mind. The cold bite of water on skin reminded each monk of impermanence, that this flesh was temporary, that one day it would stop responding to cold, to pain, to anything at all. They did not flinch. Cold was not the enemy. Distraction was. Then came incense, not burned for pleasure or ambiance, but to mark time and call attention to the unseen. The scent curled into every corner of the temple, coiling through ancient rafters and settling into the robes of those who had lit it. With it came chants, not loud, not melodic, but steady. Words repeated for years until they lost meaning, then found deeper ones. The vibration of each syllable filled the lungs, shook the bones. It was a form of breath, a form of life. It was rhythm without music, memory without story. Chants didn't fill silence, they sharpened it. The preparation for death didn't begin with drama or fear. It began like this, with water, with robes, with silence, the slow and deliberate shedding of distraction. Every motion, a quiet acceptance that nothing lasted, not the cold, not the body, not the man. Each breath was a step toward letting go, and letting go, slowly and without resistance, was the truest form of readiness. The monks of ancient Japan did not speak of death lightly, but they did speak of it often. It wasn't fear that filled their words. It was familiarity. To them, death wasn't an interruption. It was a mirror, a constant, patient shadow, always within reach. Not something to be feared, but something to be examined and accepted. They didn't wait until old age or illness to confront it. Instead, they sat with death every single day, treating it as a lifelong companion. Each morning, as the pale light of dawn crept across the polished wooden floor of the temple, the monks would take their place. Legs crossed, backs upright, their robes rustling slightly as they settled into stillness. The air was often cold, biting gently at exposed skin, but no one flinched. They breathed with quiet resolve, each inhale and exhale done with full awareness that this breath could be the last. Not because danger loomed, but because impermanence was the only certainty. This wasn't pessimism, it was discipline, a way to sharpen the mind like a blade. The monks believed that clinging to comfort or to illusions of permanence weakened the spirit. They sought to train themselves in letting go of possessions, of distractions, of ego, and ultimately, of life itself. To them, death was not a dark conclusion, but a moment of truth, one to be met with eyes wide open. Every gesture in the temple was ritualized to strengthen this mindset. The sweeping of the floors wasn't done for cleanliness alone. It was a meditation, a way of clearing the mind. The act of bowing at every doorway was not habit. It was humility in motion. Even the daily task of fetching water from the well was treated as a chance to anchor the body in the present, to move with care and attentiveness. Meals were eaten in total silence, not out of strictness, but respect. Each grain of rice was appreciated as a fleeting gift, each sip of soup taken as if it were the last. They didn't eat to indulge hunger, but to understand it. And in understanding it, to realize how closely it mirrors all other desires, temporary, powerful, but ultimately passing. Many monks carried objects meant to remind them of transience, a single brittle leaf, a pale bone, a scrap of old funeral cloth. These were not tokens of morbidity, but tools of clarity. They were kept close, touched often, gazed upon during quiet moments. Symbols of truth, of what lies beneath all appearances. They chanted sutras that spoke of fading blossoms, of flowing rivers, of smoke that drifts and disappears. Their voices, rising and falling in unison, created a sound like wind through pine trees, a reminder that even the voice, even the breath that carries it, is borrowed. When someone in the nearby village was sick or dying, monks would sit beside them, not to heal, but to accompany. They would speak little, if at all. Their presence alone, calm and grounded, was their offering. They performed funeral rites, not with tears, but with stillness, reciting sacred texts that guided the soul gently away from the world it once knew. Cremation was not a spectacle, but a lesson. Monks often stayed and watched the entire process, from the lighting of the fire to the final settling of ash. They did not look away. They did not shield themselves from the smell, the smoke, the heat. They observed the transformation. They absorbed it. And in doing so, they faced the mirror again. Every crack in the old floorboards, every flickering flame, every petal that drifted down from the temple's ancient cherry trees carried the same lesson. Nothing lasts. Everything changes. Everything ends. And so the monks prepared, not for some dramatic final breath, but for the quiet dissolving of self that happens gradually, every day, in the relinquishing of a thought, the surrender of an attachment, the letting go of a moment. One breath in, one breath out, one step closer to readiness, and perhaps one step closer to peace. In the hushed stillness of early morning, long before even the first cicada dared to stir in the trees, the monks were already awake, not jolted from sleep by clanging bells or urgent cries, but gently pulled into consciousness by the quiet tug of habit, a rhythm etched into their bones by years, sometimes decades, of ritual and repetition. The sun had not yet risen. The temple grounds, blanketed in deep shadow, lay utterly still. Nothing moved, no footsteps, no voices. And yet, within the worn wooden halls of the monastery, soft figures glided silently, barefoot on floors polished smooth by generations. This was not a time for noise, not a time for chatter or tasks or even prayer. This was the hour of beginning, of preparation, not for labor, and not even for spiritual contemplation in the traditional sense, but for discipline, physical discipline, the body before the mind, hardship before reflection, because comfort was not the goal here. In fact, comfort was deliberately denied. These monks were not seeking pleasure or peace. They were rehearsing absence, rehearsing detachment, rehearsing the slow, daily process of disappearing from the world while still inhabiting it. Their first act of the day was not to eat, not to pray, not even to speak. It was to meet the water, always cold, always from the earth, either pulled fresh from a deep well or scooped from the icy fingers of a mountain stream. There were no warm baths in the early hours, no gradual easing into the day. The water was poured slowly, deliberately, over bare skin. It ran down spines, across shoulders, into eyes that had barely opened. The shock of it was sharp, immediate. It forced alertness. It stung. And that sting was intentional. It was not a punishment, but a reminder that life, in its rawest form, is both fleeting and vivid, and that one day, very soon, it would no longer be. Afterward, without pause, came the cleaning of the temple grounds. But this was not housework, not a chore assigned begrudgingly. It was spiritual training in disguise. Brooms were handled like sacred tools. Every fallen leaf, every loose speck of dirt, every tiny blossom shaken loose from the cherry trees by the wind was gently, thoroughly removed, not to make the place look neat or pristine. That wasn't the point. The point was focus, presence, precision. To sweep was to empty, to practice letting go, to erase distraction. Every stroke of the broom was a small act of surrender, a rehearsal for death by way of attention. Then came zazen, seated meditation, a central pillar of monastic practice and one of its most demanding, not physically at first glance, but deeply, brutally demanding all the same. The monks would fold themselves into position, legs crossed painfully, knees pressed to the mat, hands resting in calculated stillness. The back remained perfectly upright, the chin slightly tucked, the eyes open, but softened. Breathing was slow, intentional, and then stillness. Complete stillness, for minutes, for hours, depending on the day. No motion, no talking, no relief. And in that forced silence, the real work began. The mind, denied escape, began to thrash. Thoughts rushed in. Aches bloomed in joints. Feet went numb. Stillness didn't create peace. It revealed the chaos already inside. And confronting that chaos, sitting with it, enduring it, witnessing it without flinching, was the point. This life, from the outside, might have looked like punishment, like self-denial for its own sake. But it wasn't. It wasn't even about morality. It was about readiness. The monks were preparing. For the moment, none of us escape. Death. And not in a poetic, distant way. They believed the final moment, the last exhale, the clarity or confusion of it, held meaning. And so, they trained for it. Not once, not when they were sick, but every single day, every morning, before the sun, before the world, in silence. Because when death came, they wanted to meet it wide awake, far from the bustling markets, distant from the clamor of warlords and the strict hierarchies of feudal society. There was a quieter, more withdrawn existence unfolding in the mountain shadows of ancient Japan. This was not a life driven by ambition, wealth, or power. It was a path shaped by discipline, surrender, and deep contemplation. Monks who lived in secluded temples chose to dedicate their entire lives to a single inescapable truth. They would die. And instead of avoiding that truth, they embraced it, mindfully, deliberately. And every single day they drew breath. In this portion of the story, we begin to move deeper into the inner workings of a monk's life and mindset. It was not a world of sweeping revelations or thunderous awakenings. It was a world shaped slowly and steadily, through repetition, simplicity, and a quiet, tireless confrontation with mortality that colored even the smallest actions. From the moment their eyes opened, often long before the sun had kissed the high temple roofs, monks began their day by symbolically dying in small, deliberate ways. They relinquished comfort. They surrendered control. They untangled themselves from longing. The simple robes they draped over their shoulders, unadorned, neutral-toned, and coarse to the touch, were more than signs of humility or poverty. These garments served as daily reminders that everything, including identity itself, would one day vanish. No pride, no status, no wealth, not even the body could last. These robes weren't just worn, they were inhabited as a way to practice vanishing. Their morning rituals didn't begin with warmth, luxury, or ease. They began with the sting of icy water. Ritual cleansing was far more than personal hygiene. It was a gateway to presence. Splashing freezing water over their faces, necks, and arms, especially during the coldest winter months, was a way to shock the senses awake. It was a kind of spiritual confrontation, one that said, "Be here, be now, endure this." There was no fire nearby to soften the blow, no towel waiting to offer comfort. Only breath, mindfulness, and the sting of the moment. Pain was part of the lesson. Discomfort had value. It stripped away illusion. It brought clarity. It burned off distraction. Meals were taken in absolute silence. This wasn't a punishment, nor merely a strict rule to enforce discipline. It was because silence opened a door to listening, to inner rhythms, to subtle awareness, to stillness. They listened not to others, but to the sounds of chewing, to the subtle act of swallowing, to the body's quiet labor of digestion. Every bite of food was eaten with intention, slowly, carefully, not for pleasure but with deep reverence. Each grain of rice, every spoonful of thin broth was treated as a gift, not a feast, but a fragile offering. There was always the awareness. This could be the final meal. There was no hoarding, no gorging, no shrinking in fear, just acceptance, just grace. A monk did not eat to celebrate nor to indulge. They ate to live, and they lived to practice dying well. Even walking was transformed into sacred repetition. Their feet moved in slow procession through moss-lined paths and gravel courtyards. each step stripped of urgency. There was no rush, no push toward destination. Walking itself was the meditation, each step an opportunity to surrender, to release the need for control, to let go of impatience. The practice wasn't just about pace, it was about presence. Each movement became a teaching. Each quiet step was a soft reminder that there was nowhere to get to, no race to finish, not in life, and certainly not in death. Death was never a stranger in the lives of these monks. It was not a distant end. It was a familiar companion, an ever-present witness. It lingered in every whispered chant, in every folded bough, in every thread of incense curling through the air at dawn. Death was not shunned. It was not cursed. It was welcomed as a teacher, as a kind of mirror that never stopped reflecting truth. Every breath was informed by it. Every movement acknowledged it. Every still moment belonged to it. And the monks did not brace against this presence. They opened to it. They honored it. They practiced with it. One silent, deliberate day at a time. Even in a life designed to leave the world behind, the outside still had a way of finding its way in. Messages arrived by horseback or messenger, sometimes smuggled through unofficial channels. Letters from distant provinces painted vivid pictures of unrest. Whispers echoed through the stone halls. Rumors of rebellion, of plague sweeping the lowlands, of kings falling and thrones changing hands. The temple's isolation was a boundary, but it wasn't a wall that kept the world out completely. The silence could be broken, and often was. Monks had to live with the tension between spiritual retreat and civic responsibility. And nowhere was that tension more obvious than in the evolving role of the temple as both a sanctuary and a silent sentinel. When chaos stirred in the cities or the countryside, monks didn't always stay cloistered. They couldn't. Some temples were forced to open their gates, offering shelter to those fleeing famine, war, or natural disaster. Others became rallying points for desperate communities, not because the monks sought power or influence, but because people had nowhere else to turn. The faith of the people, thin though it may have been, still carried them to the temple gates. And so the monks stepped forward, quietly, reluctantly, offering calm in the middle of the storm. Sometimes it meant organizing food for the hungry from their meager stores. Sometimes it meant tending to the sick with only herbs and prayers. And sometimes it meant standing between armed groups with nothing but robes and prayer beads, symbols of peace held like shields. These were not moments of glory. They were slow, grueling efforts that stretched the already thin resources of the monastery to their breaking point. But the monks did not see them as acts of heroism. They saw them as the weight of their vows, a burden freely accepted. Death wasn't always dramatic. It was often slow, creeping, hidden in a cough, a fever, or a festering cut. And to prepare for death meant also preparing to witness it in others. Whether it came through sickness, starvation, or deep sorrow, it was part of the world that monks could not deny. To walk away would be easier. But to stay, that was the path. Meditation continued, even in crisis. Rituals did not stop. They shifted. The rhythm changed. Nights grew longer. The chanting grew softer, deeper, more mournful. And monks sat not only with their own breath, but with the sounds of weeping from those they sheltered, the muffled sobs echoing through stone corridors. Peace in those moments was not the absence of suffering. It was the choice to remain, to witness, to be still in the face of pain, to offer presence, even when no answers could be given. Even when the world came knocking, loud, chaotic, and unrelenting, the monks didn't flinch. They adjusted. They endured. They breathed. And they continued. Because that was the practice. That was the preparation. That was the vow made flesh. The path to preparing for death wasn't just mental or spiritual. It was physical. Every movement mattered. Monks trained their bodies as deliberately as they trained their minds. This wasn't martial prowess, not in the way soldiers trained for battle, but it was discipline all the same. Daily routines were tightly regimented, rising before dawn, hours of sitting, stretching, walking, bowing. Each motion refined awareness, each repetition strengthened resolve. Even sweeping the floor wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about presence, humility, readiness. Monks believed that if the body was undisciplined, the mind would follow, so they kept themselves lean and alert. Meals were sparse but balanced, often consisting of rice, gruel, wild herbs, pickled vegetables. The simplicity was intentional. Nothing to indulge in, nothing to crave. Hunger became a teacher. Cold mornings became teachers. Pain in the knees during prolonged meditation, another lesson. It all served the same end: acceptance, endurance, clarity. Some sects took this even further. They practiced austere rituals designed to strip away attachment to the body altogether. Fasting was common. Cold baths in winter. Silence for days or even months at a time. The point wasn't suffering for its own sake. It was to cut through the illusion of comfort. If you could face hunger, silence, loneliness, and physical exhaustion without turning away, then maybe, just maybe, you'd be ready to face death without fear. They would chant not just for peace, but to remind themselves of impermanence. Calligraphy became meditation in motion. Each brush stroke, a moment lived and let go. Long pilgrimages were taken on foot, in silence, sometimes in harsh weather, not because they had to, but because it made the present real. The pain of walking, the rhythm of breath, the uncertainty of the road, these things burned away distraction. The ultimate expression of this commitment came in a form few dared attempt: self-mummification, sokushinbutsu. It was the most extreme, most literal way a monk could prepare for death, by dying deliberately, gradually, consciously. The process took years. First, a strict diet to rid the body of fat. Then, consuming bark and roots, drinking toxic teas to prevent decay. Meditation never stopped. Burial alive came last. A small chamber underground. A bamboo tube for air. A bell rung each day to signal the monk was still alive. When the bell stopped ringing, the tomb was sealed. Centuries later, some of those monks remained, bodies intact, eyes closed, still seated in meditation. This wasn't a search for sainthood or martyrdom. It wasn't spectacle. It was the final test of detachment, to choose your death, to make it part of your practice, to go willingly into stillness, without fanfare, without witness, to remove even the last breath from the list of unknowns. Most monks didn't go that far, but even for them, the lesson was clear. Death was not a stranger to be feared. It was a companion, a shadow you learned to walk beside. Every chant, every chore, every breath was a rehearsal. They practiced dying a little each day, letting go of pride, comfort, ego, learning how to say goodbye before they had to. When a monk did die, it wasn't seen as tragedy. Fellow monks didn't mourn in the usual sense. They sat with the body, they chanted for hours, they bathed the body with reverence. It was part of the cycle, nothing out of place. And for those still living, it was a reminder: your time will come. Are you ready? And when the final breath came, it would be taken with the same care as the first, fully aware, fully present. The goal was never to escape death, but to meet it without flinching, to treat it not as an interruption, but as part of the flow, not an ending, a completion, a return to stillness. If you wanted to find a place where death felt ordinary, not ominous, the monastery was it. Death didn't sneak up there. It was expected, tracked, studied. A visitor whose arrival was not just inevitable, but welcomed with calm. The monks lived with so little that the boundary between life and death wasn't dramatic. It was a narrowing, a quieting, a final exhale. It wasn't a cliff. It was a doorway they had passed in meditation 1,000 times. The entire structure of monastic life leaned toward that final threshold. The walls were bare, the robes simple, the diet austere. There were no distractions, no wealth, no clutter. A monk could die in the same spot. He had meditated for decades and nothing would need to be changed. No preparations were rushed because they had already been made. There were rituals for that moment, not loud, not elaborate. A simple sitting posture, hands folded, eyes open or closed, depending on the monk's final state. Those nearby would gather and chant the Heart Sutra, or another passage that reminded them, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. The dying monk would often recite lines too, if breath allowed. Some even smiled. It wasn't about making peace in a rush. Peace had already been made, years before. This was just the last step in a long walk. Some traditions believed in consciously choosing the moment of death. A monk, after years of practice, would feel his end approaching and enter meditation one final time, deliberately stepping into stillness with full awareness. Dying wasn't seen as something that happened to them, it was something they participated in. That mindset changed everything. It wasn't resistance, it was release. The monastery kept records of each passing, not just names and dates, but final words, physical posture, even the weather. Not for vanity, for teaching, for reflection. The idea wasn't to glorify death, it was to understand it, to prepare the next in line. Every life added another line to the unbroken scroll of practice. Students would read these records and sit where the monk had sat. They would memorize what was said. They would visualize that final moment as part of their own preparation. And those who remained, they didn't collapse into grief. They returned to the schedule. The morning bell still rang. The meals were still cooked. Meditation still began at dawn. Life didn't pause. Because it wasn't a pause. It was continuation. One breath stopping, the next beginning. A hand released, another taken up. Grief was felt, but not clung to. It was acknowledged, honored, then let go, like everything else in the practice. Sometimes they carved memorial tablets. Sometimes they didn't. The greatest tribute was imitation, to live as mindfully as the one who had gone before. Monks didn't cling to legacies. They clung to the practice. The act of living with intention was the only real memorial. Stories were told not to elevate, but to guide. The message was always the same. Live simply, die clearly. And so the cycle continued. Silence, chanting, work, stillness, breath, fewer distractions, fewer attachments, simpler lives, clearer minds. A daily readiness for the end, not out of morbidity, but out of reverence. They didn't ignore death. They included it. It wasn't a dark corner. It was part of the light. For monks, death wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was a fact to be honored, a mirror to live by. They practiced every day to hold that mirror without fear, to recognize themselves in its reflection, and to smile. And when your time came, the question wasn't, what happens next? It was, did I live like I meant it? Did I leave quietly with no debts to settle, no words unsaid, no fears unspoken? That was the lesson. That was the practice. That was the way. That was the peace they had spent a lifetime preparing for. The question wasn't if you would die. The question was, would you be ready when it happened? In temples across Japan, monks lived with this question every single day. But readiness didn't mean having answers. It meant stripping away everything that wasn't necessary, attachments, ambition, even identity. Death didn't care what you built, what you knew, or what titles you held. So the monks let it all go in advance. This practice, dying before death, was not about pessimism. It was about clarity. You could see more when you stopped pretending life would go on forever. And in that clarity, the smallest things became profound. The sound of water boiling, the thud of a broom on stone, the feel of sunlight on shaved skin. Nothing was rushed. Nothing taken for granted. They learned to recognize the sacred hidden inside repetition, inside the ordinary. Even a single sip of tea became a moment to be fully alive. Even the aching of legs during long hours of sitting became a reminder. You are here. You are still breathing. And that, for now, is enough. Monks were not fearless. Fear came, like wind through paper walls. But they didn't fight it. They sat with it, named it, watched it pass. That was the discipline. Not to conquer emotion, but to see it without flinching. To greet fear as a messenger, not a master. Their relationship to fear was intimate. They knew its shape, its triggers, its voice, and still they chose stillness. Their daily rituals were mundane by design. The point wasn't ecstasy or enlightenment, it was presence. Wash the rice pot, fold the robe, offer incense, bow. Again, again. Each act an anchor to the moment, and each moment one step closer to release. In fact, the repetition itself became a quiet kind of liberation. There was no need for excitement. The work was enough. The breath was enough. They cleaned floors that would be dusty again tomorrow. They prepared meals that would soon be gone. They copied sutras that others had copied for centuries. These were not wasted efforts. These were declarations. I am here. I am not Russian. I am not hiding from the end. Preparation wasn't a moment at the end. It was the whole path. A monk who died while sweeping had died well. A monk who died in silence, unnoticed, had died well. There were no grand endings, only continuity. The life and the death, inseparable. Breath in, breath out. Then, no breath. Stillness. Some monks wrote death poems. Short verses meant to be read once, just before the end. They didn't have to be clever or beautiful. They just had to be true. A single image, a fleeting thought, a line like, the candle flickers, then steadies. A breath, and then gone. That was enough. That was release. That was the aim. Not to live forever, but to be fully alive while it lasted. To stand ready for the final moment. Not armored, but open. Nothing left unsaid, because nothing needed saying. And when the end came, there was no panic. Only breath, and then none. Just stillness. And that was fine. Not all preparation was quiet. Sometimes it was loud in its silence, an entire life recalibrated to listen for the moment death might speak. Monks didn't just prepare alone, they trained each other. Elders passed down not just rituals, but attitude. Young monks were corrected constantly, not out of cruelty, but to sharpen their attention. You missed a step. Your mind wandered during chanting. Your breath is shallow. Every detail mattered because every detail belonged to the practice. And the practice? It was life itself, shaped entirely around the inevitability of death. This wasn't just spiritual, it was structured. Training schedules were strict. Silence hours were enforced. Even mistakes had purpose. If a novice burned the rice, they might be told, do it again, but slower. Not out of impatience, but because slow meant present. And present was everything. Attention was the currency they traded in. Attention to how incense curled in the air, to how footsteps echoed in empty halls, to the rise and fall of one's chest. If you noticed enough, death stopped being theoretical. It became tactile, real, immediate. Some temples had death rooms, small, unadorned spaces where monks would go when they felt the end approaching. No distractions. No farewells. Just the final breath, taken on the same floor where they had bowed thousands of times. There was no fear in these spaces, just stillness. The point was to face the final moment with the same focus given to any other task. Death wasn't separate. It wasn't elevated. It was part of the schedule. In these rooms, simplicity ruled. One cushion, maybe a scroll, maybe not. A candle might burn low, casting soft shadows, flickering against the bare wooden walls. The atmosphere held no drama, only quiet. It was here that monks hoped to meet the end like a friend, not an enemy. They had practiced for this for years. The posture didn't change. The breathing stayed steady. There was nothing to add, nothing left to remove. Visiting monks sometimes came to observe a dying brother, not with sorrow, but with respect. A lesson was unfolding. One last teaching. What did he cling to? What did he release? Was his posture steady? Was his breath even? Some took notes. Others closed their eyes and simply listened. You could learn more in that room than from 100 lectures. Because theory was easy. Death was real. Outside, the world spun on. Seasons changed. Farmers planted, harvested, struggled, celebrated. The monastery stayed quiet, but it wasn't isolated in the way most imagine. Monks received visitors. Villagers brought offerings, rice, dried fish, coins. Some came with questions. How should I prepare for my father's death? How do I face my own? The monks rarely gave direct answers. Instead, they pointed to the path. Sit, breathe, pay attention, let go, repeat. The temple, in this way, became a kind of living guidebook, not in pages, but in people. The rhythm of the place was its own teaching, the predictability, the patience, the silence. Everything the monks did was a rehearsal, even funerals, especially funerals. They weren't occasions for grief so much as mirrors, reflecting the truth everyone tries to avoid. The ceremony was spare, the fire was hot, the body returned to ash. And then the bell rang, and the living bowed, and they returned to work. Some monks said the fire was just another version of impermanence, that watching the body burn helped dissolve the illusion of self. The person wasn't gone. They were changed. Smoke, ash, memory. Monks swept the ashes like they swept the floor, with full attention and no drama, because life didn't stop for death. It made room for it, and then it continued, like breath, in, outside. There were no clocks in the monastery. Time moved with the sun, with the seasons, with the breath. The rhythm of life was measured not in minutes, but in tasks completed, in prayers recited, in the light shifting across stone walls. But even in this slow, deliberate world, age crept in. Knees stiffened, backs curved, sight dimmed, hands trembled when pouring tea. Some monks spent their final years in near silence, their voices worn thin from decades of chanting and cold winters. Others remained sharp to the end, minds like still water, bodies like brittle branches waiting for a breeze. Death didn't sneak up. It was announced, not with words but with small signs, a missed meal, a shorter walk, a longer pause after bowing, a hand resting too long on a cane, a longer time spent looking out the window. And when a monk sensed the end was close, they didn't hide from it. They leaned in. They prepared the same way they prepared for meditation, for winter, for anything sacred. Belongings were given away. Robes mended and folded one last time. Apologies were offered in quiet hallways. Final teachings, if any, were whispered to younger monks with bowed heads. And then they sat. Sometimes death came in the meditation hall, quiet as a closing door. Other times in bed, surrounded by fellow monks holding vigil. The ritual didn't call for drama. No last-minute confessions or declarations. Just breathe. Just stillness. Just presence. A monk might die while chanting, or while watching the moon rise, or simply while sitting, hands resting in their lap, spine straight, face calm. A final breath taken like any other, without resistance. The body was washed with warm water and wrapped in clean cloth. A gesture of care, not preservation. It wasn't embalmed or dressed in finery. It was allowed to return to the earth naturally, sometimes cremated in a small fire behind the temple, sometimes buried beneath trees in simple wooden boxes, ashes placed under stones with no inscriptions, no elaborate tombs, no golden statues. Just a name, maybe, a season, a memory kept quietly in the hearts of those who remained. Grief was not broadcast. It was held in posture, in silence, in an extra bow. Monks didn't believe in avoiding death. They believed in meeting it, and not just meeting it, but bowing to it, accepting it as the last teacher, the one who arrived when the lessons were done, when the daily disciplines had shaped the soul into something ready. They believed death, like life, should be faced with open eyes, steady breath, and no illusion of permanence. No one rushed grief, but no one clung to it either. After the mourning, after the chants and the silent meal shared in memory, life continued. The floor still needed sweeping. The soup still needed stirring. The robes still needed patching. The world didn't pause for long, and that, too, was a kind of mercy. Sorrow was folded into the rhythm of life, not set apart from it. To prepare for death every day wasn't morbid. It was practical. It made life sharper. It made every moment count. It reminded the monks, and maybe us, that nothing is guaranteed, not even the next breath. So each task, each word, each silence was chosen with care, not because they were afraid of dying, but because they were committed to living deliberately. And so they lived accordingly, fully, quietly, on purpose, in the knowledge that the last moment would come not as a surprise, but as a familiar friend arriving on time. There was no ceremony when a monk began preparing for death. It wasn't marked on a calendar or declared aloud. There was no feast, no rite of passage. It came quietly, gradually, like dawn light creeping into a cold room, unnoticed until it had filled the space. One day you simply began letting go, of possessions, of attachments, of arguments you no longer wanted to win, of ambitions, of your name even. The outer world dimmed and the inner world sharpened into focus. There was no clear line crossed, just a shift, soft, slow, permanent. Senior monks often recognized the signs. A younger monk would begin rising even earlier, while the sky still held stars. He'd speak less, choose silence where he once filled space with thought. He'd linger longer in bowing, take extra care with folding robes or lighting incense. It wasn't about withdrawal. It was about refinement. Every action became intentional. Meals were eaten slowly, not out of ritual, but out of reverence. Each bite was a farewell. Breaths were counted like beads on a string. The body wasn't neglected. It was honored, washed gently, dressed simply, cared for like an old friend who would soon be departing. And the detachment wasn't gloomy. There was no sadness in it. The monks didn't see death as a loss, but as a culmination, the final teaching, the final test. The idea wasn't to fight death. That would be pointless. The idea was to meet it cleanly, with no debts, no regrets, no fear. The monk's work wasn't to cling, but to release. To release identity, memory, even the illusion of self, to loosen the grip on this life, not because it was unworthy, but because it had been lived. In the final weeks, if the monk was conscious and able, they would often choose solitude, a small cell, a mat, maybe a single candle. Visitors were allowed but not encouraged. Words became fewer. A glance, a gesture, a breath said more than speech. Some monks spent their last days copying sutras, brush in hand, until the hand failed. Others sat in zazen, unmoving, until breath left of its own accord. Some sang, some simply listened. There was no set script, only a deep quiet shaped by a lifetime of preparation. And when the end came, there was no fanfare, no desperate grasping. The room was quiet, the air still. A single breath, then none. A stillness that was not absence, but a kind of presence that filled the space more fully than sound ever could. The other monks would sit with the body. They would not rush. They would not grieve in loud ways. They would chant, soft and steady, guiding the departed as one guides a traveler setting out on a long road. That was enough. No drama, no thunder. Just the final note of a life practiced like an instrument. The bow laid down, the strings at rest. Finished, not because it ended, but because it was complete. A life polished like a stone by time, pressure, and stillness. A final moment taken with the same care as every step that came before it. And in that there was peace, not as a goal, but as a consequence of practice. By now, death wasn't a mystery, it was a neighbor. Familiar, constant. The monks didn't fear it, but they didn't romanticize it either. They studied it the way one studies the sky before a storm, not to stop it, but to know how to stand in its path without being swept away. They learned its seasons, its signals. They learned to notice the flickers in breath, the soft tremors in the hands, the slowing appetite, the fatigue that arrived like an old friend. And most of all, they learned how to meet it with composure. The rituals had changed over time. Some were simplified. Others became more elaborate, depending on the lineage or the era. But the core remained the same. Presence, stillness, clarity. When a monk fell ill, there was no panic, no scrambling for remedies, no denial. He would inform the abbot with calm. A bell might be rung, not to sound alarm, but to begin the final watch. Then he would begin his final preparation. His robe was cleaned, his space tidied. His few possessions, perhaps a begging bowl, a string of beads, a scrap of handwritten sutras, were placed in order or passed to others. He might request one last bowl of rice, not for hunger, but as a ritual act, a closing note. Final letters were sometimes written, but usually not. Farewells were brief. There was no need to say much. Life in the monastery was built on shared silence, and in the end, that silence said enough. The monks understood one another without words. They had practiced this, lived it, breathed it. A monk would then settle into meditation. The others would gather nearby, not in mourning, not in grief, but in quiet solidarity. No one tried to comfort. That wasn't the point. Comfort implied something was wrong, but to them, nothing was wrong. This was the path. Comfort was attachment, and so instead, they offered the one thing that mattered most: presence, steady breathing, shared space, a unified rhythm. Sometimes the monk would die while seated, spine straight, face calm. Other times he would lie down gently, arms at his sides, breath growing quieter with each passing hour. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was done awake, with intention, with clarity. After death, the body wasn't treated as something to be hidden or rushed away. It was washed by hand, dressed in fresh robes, and often left seated in the meditation posture for one last day. Incense was lit. The others would chant, not to save the soul, not to plead or bargain, but simply to accompany it. Not to beg for peace, but to acknowledge it. The room was quiet, but not somber. The air held the weight of reverence. Depending on the tradition, the body might be cremated or buried. There was no urgency. There was no fear of decay. The body was part of the cycle. Ashes fed the earth. The earth fed the future. Insects might touch the flesh. Roots might grow through it. It was all as it should be. Nature reclaiming what was never separate to begin with. In that way, Even in death, a monk remained useful, not in a grand, heroic sense, not in legacy or legend, but in stillness, in humility. In the quiet way a candle lights the next before going out, in the patience of a seed becoming soil again, in the echo of a breath that continues through others. The younger monks would watch, they'd witness, and through that witnessing, they would learn. Not through words or sermons, but through the slow, silent choreography of a death done with grace. Death wasn't an end. It was a handoff. It was a bow, a return to breathless stillness. There's a quiet truth most people miss about the end. It's not always loud. Sometimes it arrives like a breath leaving the body, a whisper, not a scream. That's the truth monks lived with. The end wasn't some dramatic moment. It was a continuation of the path they'd walked every day, a smooth step into the next space. No fear, no struggle, just stillness. By part 18, most people expect a climax, but for the monks, there was no climax, no final sermon, no heroic gesture. The practice didn't end, it just became quieter, softer, even more focused. The rhythm of days slowed, but never stopped. Rituals didn't fade, they deepened. Silence was no longer an effort, it was a way of being. A monk nearing death didn't cling. He simplified. He ate less, spoke little, gave away his few belongings, maybe a robe, maybe a prayer bead, maybe nothing at all. He spent more time in zazen, the seated meditation that looked like nothing from the outside, but was everything on the inside. His breath grew slower, his steps lighter. He became like mist. Not gone, but not quite here either. In the final weeks, he might spend entire days in stillness, eyes half closed, body unmoving. Other monks didn't disturb him. They knew what he was doing. He was making peace with each passing moment, letting go of sensation, identity, history. He was thinning the veil between presence and absence, training for the last breath as he had trained for the first. Sometimes they would write a death poem, a few lines, no revisions, a final note to the world, not to explain anything, but to mark the moment. One monk wrote, "I came from silence, I return without regret. The moon was enough." That was it. Nothing flowery, no desperation, just presence. Others left no words at all, only the memory of a smile or a bowed head. That too was enough. The temple didn't hold funerals in the way we think of them. No eulogies, no inflated memories, just ritual. Clean the body, wrap it, chant, cremate, return the ashes to the earth or to a small urn placed in a wall niche. Simple, sacred, unsentimental. Grief wasn't denied. It was acknowledged, held gently, then released like a breath. Mourning was folded into the same rhythm as living. There was a deep comfort in that. Everyone knew their place in the cycle. No one was above it. Death wasn't failure. It wasn't unfair. It was expected, even welcomed, as a moment to demonstrate the fruits of a lifetime of training. For the dying monk, it was his last offering to the Sangha. For the living monks, it was their next lesson. And life moved on. The bell still rang in the morning. The floors were still swept. The sutras were still chanted. The rice was still cooked and shared. The monk's passing wasn't seen as loss. It was proof that the practice worked, that peace was possible, that preparation wasn't wasted. It reaffirmed the quiet power of a life lived intentionally, without excess or fear. It reminded them that enlightenment wasn't some distant flash of insight, but the slow, steady polishing of the soul until it reflected everything and nothing at once. Winter arrived without announcement. Snow fell not in storms, but in slow, steady layers, muting the world until even sound itself seemed to kneel. The temple roofs wore thick white coats. The garden stones vanished beneath soft drifts, and the air smelled of cedar and cold earth. The wind crept around corners like a patient hunter, brushing across the wooden beams, slipping beneath door frames. The forest beyond the walls went still. Even the birds grew quiet. Monks still walked the paths between buildings, robes tucked close, breath steaming in the stillness. Nothing in the schedule changed. Only the world around it did. The cold tested the body, but that was part of the point. No fires blazed for comfort. Only what was necessary. Just enough heat to keep ink from freezing, hands from stiffening. Monks wrote with gloves on, meditated with bare shoulders, washed their bowls with ice-crusted water. The hardship wasn't punishment. It was purification. Every tremble of the body was another reminder of impermanence. No moment was taken for granted. Warmth, when it came, was fleeting, found in the closeness of another body during silent tea, or in the way steam curled up from a bowl of barley soup, caught briefly in the pale morning light. Even the chants sounded different in winter. The low, rhythmic syllables bounced off snow-covered courtyards and stone walls, echoing as if the mountain itself had begun to whisper. The wooden fish drum sounded deeper, heavier. The monastery seemed to fold in on itself. Less speaking, fewer footsteps, more silence, more sitting. Time became weightless. Days slid into each other like ink bleeding on wet parchment. Animals vanished. Visitors stopped coming. It was just them, the wind, the cold, and the practice. In that deep stillness, monks didn't feel isolated. They felt sharpened, focused. The world had peeled away its noise. All that remained was the breath, the body, the discipline. No past, no future. Just the slow unfolding of each moment, wrapped in frost and intention. Some monks took to the mountains during this season. They built small huts alone in the snow. Days passed without speech, without interruption. Meals were simple: boiled roots, dried mushrooms, water collected from melted snow. Nothing flavored, nothing wasted. Sleep came early. Waking came before dawn. In the hut, time felt like an illusion. What mattered was awareness, every movement intentional, every moment complete. They bowed to the rising sun. They bowed to the icicles forming along the roofline. They bowed to the ache in their knees. There were no visitors, no bells announcing arrival, only the sound of the wind breathing against the thin walls, and the occasional cracking of trees under their own frozen weight. The mind, stripped of stimulus, stopped, grasping. In its place came clarity, not dramatic or sudden, but like a frozen stream beginning to thaw from beneath. One monk once said that winter was the most honest teacher. You couldn't fake your practice in the cold. You either showed up fully or you suffered. And that suffering wasn't failure. It was feedback, a reminder to return, to breathe, to stay present even when the body screamed for ease, to let the discomfort strip away illusion and leave only the essential. Letters stopped. News from the outside world froze. The monks didn't resist. They let the silence thicken. They let the days blend. The calendar no longer held meaning. In that deep, white quiet, something remarkable happened. They began to feel weightless, not in the body, but in the mind. The kind of weightlessness that comes when you carry nothing, no ambition, no identity, no fear. The burdens they had brought with them to the monastery, old griefs, regrets, doubts, dissolved, not all at once, but like snow melting from a branch, drip by silent drip. Dreams became simpler. In sleep, they saw snow falling, a bowl resting on a wooden shelf, a door gently opening. These became enough. Even the dreams had let go of noise. And when spring eventually returned, when the snow began to melt from the tiles and the first shoots of green poked through the slush, they didn't celebrate. They bowed, not because the winter had ended, but because it had been endured, because they had seen themselves without distraction, because the silence had taught them something they couldn't name, but wouldn't forget. Another season, another lesson. No grand meaning, just the practice. Still breathing, still here, still enough. The bell rang before dawn. Not loud, just enough to stir the body awake. One chime, then another, each separated by the length of a slow breath. The monks rose in silence as they always did. No one spoke. There was nothing new to say. Robes were adjusted. Feet moved across wooden floors worn smooth by decades of passage. Cold air settled into the lungs like medicine. It was a shared ritual, older than memory, held together by repetition and the quiet certainty of purpose. Outside, the mist hadn't yet lifted. The mountains stood like ghosts. Shadows of trees flickered in the fog. Somewhere a deer moved through the undergrowth, unseen but felt. A pair of crows called once and fell silent. The monastery had resumed its shape. Spring had not only returned, it had settled. Buds opened along the edges of stone paths. Moss glistened. The silence hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply thawed. The world had begun to breathe again, and the monastery breathed with it. Tasks began. One monk cleaned the altars. Another ground tea leaves. A third knelt in the garden, gently brushing fallen petals from the gravel. Still others fetched water, trimmed branches, or folded laundry with care. There was no urgency, no sense of outcome, only attention. The act of doing was itself complete. Time moved sideways. No one rushed. No one watched the clock. Purpose was not measured in progress, but in presence. Each action carried the same weight as a prayer. To sweep a floor was not less holy than to chant a sutra. To mend a tear in a robe was to care for the body of the practice. Every gesture, small, repeated, refined, wore away ego like water-shaping stone. The mundane was sacred. The sacred was mundane. Nothing needed to be elevated. It already was. Visitors sometimes returned with spring. Pilgrims, farmers, lost sons, wandering poets. They brought questions, hopes, offerings. Some carried illness. Some carried grief. The monks offered little in return. A seat, tea, stillness. And that was often enough. Words were not discouraged, but they weren't chased. Most visitors came wanting answers. Many left with silence. Some with something deeper. The permission to not need answers. One farmer left behind a basket of radishes. Another simply bowed and wept. An old woman came every year to sit beneath the ginkgo tree her brother had planted 50 years before. The monks asked no questions. They simply let her sit. In the afternoons, birds returned to the trees. Their songs weren't loud, but they broke the winter's quiet like a crack in old ice. Monks didn't stop to marvel. They didn't need to. The birds came back. That was enough. The garden hummed with bees. A single turtle stirred in the pond. The stone lanterns grew warm to the touch. In one corner of the monastery, a monk practiced walking meditation. Slowly, deliberately, heel, then toe. Heel, then toe. Each step an act of remembering. That the body was here, that breath was here, that this was life unfolding. He walked the same circle again and again until the circle dissolved and there was only step after step after step. The old master watched from under the eaves. He said nothing, only nodded once, then returned to his tea. The younger monks didn't notice. They were busy living the same day they lived yesterday and would live tomorrow. No performance necessary. Their lives weren't about seeking attention. Their lives were about vanishing into the act. When the sun lowered behind the mountain, light spilled in wide amber stripes across the wooden floors. The bell rang again. The final bow was made. Sutras were folded shut. Lamps were lit. One by one, the monks withdrew into their rooms. The silence returned, not as absence, but as fullness, as the thing that had always been waiting beneath the noise. The night air turned cool. Crickets sang low in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a fox cried once and was gone. Inside the walls, stillness held its shape. And so, it continued. Not because it had to, because it was enough. Because it always had been. Some of the most important lessons were never taught aloud. They were absorbed. Through watching, through repetition, through failing in small, quiet ways. Through getting it wrong again and again, until the body learned what the mind couldn't explain. A novice might be assigned to sweep the same path every morning, the same stretch of stone walkway from the main gate to the bell tower. At first, he would rush through it, eager to finish, dust flying, brooms scraping loudly. Then he would be told to start over, and again, until he understood that the goal wasn't a clean path. It was a clean mind. One motion, one breath, no hurry, no dragging, just presence, until sweeping became meditation, until the stone beneath the broom felt like part of his own hand. This was how the monastery trained you, through the mundane, folding robes with perfect corners, scrubbing pots until they gleamed with nothing but ash and water, refilling oil lamps without spilling a drop, hauling buckets from the stream in winter without complaint. Each act a mirror, each mistake an invitation, each repetition an edge to hone the self against. No lectures, just rhythm. A rhythm you either tuned into or stumbled against. Some couldn't handle it. The repetition, the silence, the way the monastery stripped away everything that made you feel unique or clever or important. The stories you told about yourself dissolved. What was left was raw, vulnerable, unsure. Many left, sometimes after a few weeks, sometimes after a few years. The pressure to perform vanished, but so did the distractions. And when you were alone with your own mind, many found that unbearable. And the monks let them go. No judgment, just a bow, a silent wish for peace. For those who stayed, the days folded into each other until time lost its edges. What had once felt boring became subtle. Layers emerged inside the repetition. A new tone in a familiar chant, a different weight in a ceramic bowl, a shift in posture while kneeling. An insight triggered not by thought, but by motion, pouring water, lighting incense, stepping through a threshold just as the light shifted. Awareness bloomed in unlikely places, the sound of rain dripping from the eaves, the sensation of cold stone under bare feet, the weight of silence during communal meals. The older monks didn't smile often, but when they did, it was never out of politeness. It meant something had landed. A young monk bowing at the right depth, a hand resting lightly instead of grasping. A mistake met with stillness instead of shame. A question answered not with words, but with a quiet breath. Progress wasn't marked by ceremony. It showed up in posture, in how long you could sit without fidgeting, in how you listened, in whether you could hold the silence without needing to fill it. And then gradually, the responsibilities changed. One day, a monk would be told to wake earlier, to take charge of morning bells, or to lead a chant, or to guide the youngest in how to hold their bowls properly. No praise, no applause, just a nod from the teacher. The message was clear. You've ripened. Keep going. You were no longer just repeating the rhythm. You had become part of it. There was no ceremony, no title, no sudden shift. Just the next task, the next breath, the next morning, indistinguishable from the last, except that now, you stood a little more firmly, moved a little more quietly, thought a little less about yourself. No shortcuts, no stories, just a life lived deliberately, a body shaped by stillness, a mind trained through friction, the kind of training that left no trace except in the bones, and even that would one day return to dust. But while it lasted, it carried the weight of peace. The old monk moved slower now. His steps were small and measured, his feet soft against the temple's worn stone paths. He no longer joined the others for long walks through the forest or spent hours seated in the meditation hall. His knees ached, and sometimes his breath caught in his throat without warning. But he smiled more often. Not with his mouth, with his whole posture. He moved like someone who had stopped rushing a long time ago, as if every moment had finally become enough. In the mornings, he swept the same short path outside his room. Back and forth, back and forth. The broom bristles wore down, but he didn't replace them. He said a fraying broom taught better attention. He paused at every turn, noticing the shape of fallen leaves, the patterns of dust, the way the morning light angled across the threshold. His work was not a task. It was a dialogue with the day. At noon, he boiled water for tea, poured it into a chipped bowl, and sat quietly as steam curled through the air. No ceremony. Just water, just leaves, just time. He sipped slowly as if each mouthful deserved a moment to be understood. Younger monks often came to sit near him, not because he taught, but because he didn't try to. He didn't speak unless spoken to. And even then, his answers came like stone dropping into a still pond. Simple, unhurried, and strangely heavy. His presence carried more than words ever could. He would look at the novices with calm, unblinking eyes, listening more deeply than they were used to being heard. One day, a novice asked, "When did you feel ready?" The old monk chuckled, then looked up at the clouds drifting beyond the tiled eaves. "I never did," he said. "I just stopped needing to be." His room was bare, a folded robe, a single mat, a faded scroll with the character for emptiness, brushed in thick, uneven ink. He had copied it himself decades ago. When asked why he hadn't hung anything else, he replied, "One word is enough when you're listening." There were no decorations, no comforts, no distractions. The walls were plain wood, the shelves empty, the floor worn smooth by years of kneeling and bowing. And yet, the room felt complete. Nothing missing, nothing extra. He had no journals, no letters. He once said that if his life couldn't be remembered through action, it wasn't worth remembering. He didn't fear being forgotten. He didn't expect to be remembered. What mattered was that the path continued, that someone else picked up the broom, poured the tea, sat in silence. His legacy was not in memory, but in momentum. In his final days, he did not take to his bed. He rose each morning, bowed to the sun, swept his path. He moved more slowly, rested more often, but the rhythm never broke. One evening, just after lighting a stick of incense, he settled onto his mat, his hands folded in his lap, eyes half closed, a faint trace of sandalwood in the air. He exhaled, and didn't inhale again. No final words, no struggle, just a body gone still. No ceremony was held. His bowl was passed to a novice. His mat was returned to the storeroom. His robe was washed and folded, given to someone younger. His name was not carved into stone. There were no records, no tribute, just a quiet shift in the air. But the path he walked was still there. The floor he swept was still clean. The kettle still boiled. The silence he lived inside now held one more breath. The stillness lingered in corners, in echoes, in posture. And so the practice continued. Not in tribute, not in mourning, but because that's what the path asked for. Because the tea still needed pouring. Because the mat still needed someone to sit on it. Because someone was always ready to walk it. Even if they didn't feel ready. Even if they never would. Even if readiness was never the point. The temple bell rang once before dawn. A low, resonant note that traveled through mist and cedar, across the sleeping roofs into the bones of anyone awake enough to hear it. The sound didn't command. It invited. It asked nothing. It simply was. A breath before movement. A vibration that hung in the air long after the bell itself went silent. Monks stirred. One by one, they rose from their futons without speaking. They folded blankets, swept their rooms with straw brooms, and stepped into sandals still cold from the night. The corridors were dim. Paper lanterns glowed softly against wooden beams. And outside, the sky hovered between violet and black. The world hadn't fully woken yet. The temple existed in that narrow space between dream and duty. The first task was the same as always. Zazen. Seated meditation. No speech, no movement. Just breathe. Just stillness. The cold crept into their sleeves, settled in their spines. They didn't shift. They let it in. The pain became part of the posture. Frost gathered on windowsills. Birds waited for first light. And inside, monks sat like stones, unmoving, embedded in the moment. This wasn't a performance. There were no eyes watching, no one keeping score. Just discipline, practiced alone, yet together, each monk facing himself. Sometimes their legs went numb. Sometimes tears welled without reason. Sometimes nothing happened at all. And that, too, was part of it. After meditation came chores. Some cleaned the latrines. Others chopped vegetables, carried buckets, tended the small fire in the main hall. Every task was a kind of prayer. Attention was the offering. No job was beneath another. No act was rushed. Even the sound of a rag on a wooden floor or the slow drip of water from a ladle was treated as part of the liturgy. Nothing wasted. Nothing added. There was no conversation. Only gestures. A bowed head. A passed bowl. A door held open. It wasn't silence meant to suppress. It was space. Room for the mind to hear itself without interruption. In that stillness, thoughts rose and fell like wind through bamboo. Momentary. Insubstantial. In that space, monks began to recognize their own patterns. Fear. Restlessness. Ego. The silence didn't remove these things. It revealed them. Midday brought a shared meal, plain rice, steamed greens, a slice of pickled radish, eaten slowly, eaten fully. Every grain mattered. There was gratitude, not just for the food, but for the hands that prepared it, the soil that grew it, the weather that made it possible. When the bowls were cleaned, the water used to rinse them was drunk. Nothing wasted. Not food, not time, not effort. This was a meal, and it was a mirror. In the afternoons, they studied sutras, copied scriptures by hand, ink on paper, each stroke a meditation in motion. If the brush faltered, they began again. Not out of punishment, but out of devotion. Words mattered. Shape mattered. Some tended to the garden even in cold months, clearing debris, pruning branches. To touch the earth was to stay grounded. To serve it was to remember they would one day return to it. Others repaired sandals or wove fresh rope from rice straw. Everything could be practice. Everything could be prayer. As the sun faded, the sky turned to ash. Lanterns flickered to life again. Evening chanting echoed through the halls, slow, deliberate syllables repeating over and over like a tide. Breath by breath, word by word, the hall filled with sound, then emptied. Voices joined, then disappeared. No one led, no one followed, just the chant and the air that carried it. By nightfall, they retired to their quarters. No books, no idle talk, just the sound of breath and night insects, the occasional creak of wood expanding in the cold. Dreams weren't feared or followed. They were let go upon waking. Even in sleep, the practice continued. Sleep was not escape. It was continuation, a letting go without resistance. The day ended the way it began, without spectacle, just rhythm, just presence. Nothing added, nothing missing, just the bell, just the breath, just this, just now. A monk swept the same courtyard every morning, even when the wind undid his work by noon, even when the rain filled the grooves between stones again, even when no one watched. He didn't sweep for results. He swept because it was time to sweep. The rhythm mattered more than the outcome. His hands, calloused and cracked from seasons of repetition, knew the motion without thinking. He bowed to the broom before lifting it, not out of superstition, but out of respect, for the tool, for the task, for the silence that followed. This was the core of the practice, doing without needing. No reward, no audience, no climax, just the rhythm, just the doing. That's what shaped them. The act itself was the lesson. No part of it was wasted. Each sweep, each bow, each breath folded into the next like waves on a shore, repeating, eroding the ego grain by grain. In the afternoons, some monks copied sutras by hand, not to publish, not to share, just to copy. Each brushstroke deliberate, each kanji a meditation. When ink smudged, they didn't curse. They started again. The process was the point. The slowness, the care, the act of giving full attention to one thing at a time. Hours would pass unnoticed. A single page might take an entire day. And still, they'd return the next day to do another. No rush, no pride, only presence. Some sharpened tools that didn't need sharpening. Polished wood that already gleamed. Trimmed moss around stones that barely grew. The point wasn't productivity, it was presence. To do without rush, to touch the world lightly, but completely. To move through time without trying to hold it. The ritual of care extended even to the unseen. No one needed to admire a blade for it to be sharpened. No one needed to walk the garden path for the stones to be tended. This was devotion, without audience. Others tended the garden. They pruned trees with shears, older than their own names, turned compost slowly, watered with bowls, not hoses. They never raced. The soil didn't care how fast they worked, and neither did they. A crooked sprout was not a failure. A wilting leaf was not a judgment. Nature was their co-teacher, imperfect, slow, and endlessly forgiving. Watching a seed sprout taught more than any scroll. A bell rang at the same time each day. It didn't demand. It invited. Stop what you're doing. Come back. Sit. Breathe. Begin again. The bell was a reminder, not a rule. Even if they were in the middle of writing, sweeping, or praying, they paused. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. The pause itself was sacred. There were no milestones, no signs of achievement, no celebrations of progress, just the slow erosion of ego, like a stone in a stream, shaped not by force, but by years of soft, persistent water. The transformation was almost invisible. Only the monk felt it, in a lighter breath, in a quieter mind, in the absence of need where once there was longing. Sometimes a monk would leave, quietly. No ceremony, just a bowed head, a folded robe, an absence in the meal line. No one chased them. No one judged. The path was always theirs to walk, or not. The monastery opened its doors in both directions. Returning was never praised. Leaving was never condemned. They all knew the work continued wherever one stood, but those who stayed weren't stagnant. They were refining, sharpening the blade inside, not for cutting, but for seeing what was real, and what could finally be set down. Desires softened, fears quieted, grudges faded, and in the place of all that noise came stillness, deep, steady, and unshakable. Every day was the same, and every day was different, because the monk was different, because the world, even in stillness, was always moving. The wind sounded different in autumn. The shadows fell differently in spring. A new ache in the knees taught a new kind of patience. A forgotten scent brought back an old memory, only to be released again. No one talked about enlightenment. That word had too many sharp edges. They spoke of sitting well, sweeping well, listening closely, laughing rarely but fully. They measured progress not in insight but in consistency, in how gently one closed a door, in how fully one listened without needing to speak. They didn't seek to be remembered. They sought only to remember that this breath is enough, that this step is complete, that this moment is whole, and that nothing at all was missing. Rain tapped against the wooden eaves like a soft, steady drum. It had been falling for days, soaking the mountain paths and turning the soil to thick, black mud. The gardens overflowed. The stream behind the temple swelled and spilled over its banks, rushing fast and cold. Mist rose from the ground in the early morning, clinging to stone lanterns and pine branches. The air smelled of moss and wet bark. Trees bent under the weight of water, their branches heavy and glistening. Leaves glowed a deeper green. Puddles formed in the courtyards, each reflecting a slice of the gray sky. Inside the temple, sandals were left in neat, dripping rows. Robes hung to dry beside the central hearth, where a small fire burned low, its warmth modest, its crackle barely audible over the rain. The monks moved through the halls like shadows, their footsteps quiet, their sleeves damp. Nothing about the rain changed the rhythm of their day, but it shaped the tone. More inward, more watchful. Every sound became more pronounced. The rustle of a robe, the faint clink of a tea bowl, the creak of ancient wood underfoot. During the rainy season, everything slowed. Scrolls were less often opened, the ink too fussy in the damp. Conversations were fewer. Even the meals were quieter, as if the clatter of chopsticks might offend the hush outside. It was a time for reflection, for reviewing one's vows, for observing the mind more closely. The rain became a mirror. Thoughts surfaced more easily, like silt stirred from the bottom of a pond. Old memories, long buried under the tasks of daily ritual, began to drift upward. The rain gave permission to feel, to sit with whatever arose. Some monks took to walking meditation beneath the covered walkways, moving with bare feet on the slick wooden boards. Step, breathe. Step, breathe. The roof overhead protected the body, but not from the sound. The rain was constant, like breath itself, never stopping, always returning. Some walked with their eyes half closed, tracing the same loop again and again. Others stood still, simply listening, letting the sound of the downpour wash over them like a chant. In the rain, presence felt easier, less forced. Washing became a kind of ritual in itself. Buckets filled from the runoff were cold and metallic. Hands and faces were rinsed slowly. To wash one's bowl was to notice the world more intimately. Each drop, each bubble, the scent of damp clay. To wash and be washed by the season. Some monks left their bowls outside overnight, allowing the rain to cleanse them directly. There was a sense of humility in it, a willingness to let nature do the work. At night, the wind changed. It whistled through the cracks in the beams, sometimes rattling the shutters. A reminder that not everything could be sealed out, that even here, surrounded by mountains and intention, the world still moved through you. Lanterns flickered in the corridors, their light stretching long shadows across the walls. Sleep came slowly. Dreams were vivid and strange. Dreams of water, of rivers, of being carried downstream with no resistance. The elders said rain cleansed more than stone. It softened the spirit, washed dust from the soul. Grievances felt smaller during the rain, regrets quieter. The mind opened like wet earth, ready to receive whatever grew. Some monks wrote poems they would never read aloud. Others composed silent prayers, spoken only with the heart. It was a season of gentle unraveling. Nothing dramatic happened. No insight descended like lightning. But slowly, Through the repetition of ordinary days, soaked in silence and water, clarity seeped in. You began to notice what remained when everything else slowed down. The sound of your own breath, the shape of your longing, the feel of wood beneath your fingers. Not all lessons arrive with ceremony. Some come like rain, steady, patient, and impossible to ignore. They seep in through the cracks. They linger, and they change you, drop by drop. Rain tapped against the wooden eaves like a soft, steady drum. It had been falling for days, soaking the mountain paths and turning the soil to thick black mud. The gardens overflowed. The stream behind the temple swelled and spilled over its banks, rushing fast and cold. Mist rose from the ground in the early morning, clinging to stone lanterns and pine branches. The air smelled of moss and wet bark. Trees bent under the weight of water, their branches heavy and glistening. Leaves glowed a deeper green. Puddles formed in the courtyards, each reflecting a slice of the gray sky. Inside the temple, sandals were left in neat, dripping rows. Robes hung to dry beside the central hearth, where a small fire burned low, its warmth modest, its crackle barely audible over the rain. The monks moved through the halls like shadows, their footsteps quiet, their sleeves damp. Nothing about the rain changed the rhythm of their day, but it shaped the tone. More inward, more watchful. Every sound became more pronounced, the rustle of a robe, the faint clink of a tea bowl, the creak of ancient wood underfoot. During the rainy season, everything slowed. Scrolls were less often opened, the ink too fussy in the damp. Conversations were fewer. Even the meals were quieter, as if the clatter of chopsticks might offend the hush outside. It was a time for reflection, for reviewing one's vows, for observing the mind more closely. The rain became a mirror. Thoughts surfaced more easily, like silt stirred from the bottom of a pond. Old memories, long buried under the tasks of daily ritual, began to drift upward. The rain gave permission to feel, to sit with whatever arose. Some monks took to walking meditation beneath the covered walkways, moving with bare feet on the slick wooden boards. Step, breathe. Step, breathe. The roof overhead protected the body, but not from the sound. The rain was constant, like breath itself, never stopping, always returning. Some walked with their eyes half closed, tracing the same loop again and again. Others stood still, simply listening, letting the sound of the downpour wash over them like a chant. In the rain, presence felt easier, less forced. Washing became a kind of ritual in itself. Buckets filled from the runoff were cold and metallic. Hands and faces were rinsed slowly. To wash one's bowl was to notice the world more intimately. Each drop, each bubble, the scent of damp clay. To wash and be washed by the season. Some monks left their bowls outside overnight, allowing the rain to cleanse them directly. There was a sense of humility in it, a willingness to let nature do the work. At night, the wind changed. It whistled through the cracks in the beams, sometimes rattling the shutters. A reminder that not everything could be sealed out, that even here, surrounded by mountains and intention, the world still moved through you. Lanterns flickered in the corridors, their light stretching long shadows across the walls. Sleep came slowly. Dreams were vivid and strange, dreams of water, of rivers, of being carried downstream with no resistance. The elders said rain cleansed more than stone. It softened the spirit, washed dust from the soul. Grievances felt smaller during the rain. Regrets, quieter. The mind opened like wet earth, ready to receive whatever grew. Some monks wrote poems they would never read aloud. Others composed silent prayers, spoken only with the heart. It was a season of gentle unraveling. Nothing dramatic happened. No insight descended like lightning. But slowly, through the repetition of ordinary days soaked in silence and water, clarity seeped in. You began to notice what remained when everything else slowed down. The sound of your own breath, the shape of your longing, the feel of wood beneath your fingers. Not all lessons arrive with ceremony. Some come like rain, steady, patient, and impossible to ignore. They seep in through the cracks, they linger, and they change you, drop by drop.